In the vast emptiness of the North African desert, where sand and sky blur into an endless horizon, a new kind of warfare was born. It was 1942, the height of the North African campaign, and the British Eighth Army was locked in a deadly struggle against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Amid the chaos and conventional strategies of desert warfare, one officer dared to think differently. A tall, quietly confident Scotsman named David Stirling. His idea would defy military logic and set in motion one of the war's greatest mysteries. Stirling believed that small, mobile units could strike deep behind enemy lines, destroying Axis airfields, supply depots, and communications without the need for massive troop movements. The concept was revolutionary, the birth of modern special forces. Officially approved by Middle East Command in July 1941, the unit was named the Special Air Service, a deliberate deception, implying a large airborne division to mislead the enemy. In truth, it began with just 60 men. By mid-1942, the SAS had already earned a reputation for daring night raids across the desert. Operating in partnership with the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, they used stripped-down jeeps armed with twin Vickers K machine guns, capable of unleashing devastating firepower. They navigated by the stars and compass, often traveling hundreds of miles through uncharted terrain. Stirling's men struck like ghosts and vanished into the dunes before dawn. But the mission that would define the SAS legend and mystery was yet to come. In early September 1942, Stirling proposed an ambitious strike deep into Axis-held Libya. The plan, code-named Operation Bigamy, targeted key Luftwaffe installations at Benghazi, vital airfields that supported Rommel's frontline operations. The goal: cripple Axis air power ahead of the Allies' next major offensive. It was a daring idea, but fraught with risk. The operation required crossing more than 1,500 kilometers of desert, much of it unmapped, littered with mines, and patrolled by Axis aircraft. To reach Benghazi, Stirling assembled a mixed force of SAS raiders and LRDG navigators, totaling around 150 men in 40 vehicles. Each jeep was customized for endurance: extra fuel tanks, water cans, and belts of ammunition slung across the roll bars. They carried enough rations for 10 days and enough explosives to level several airfields. Every man knew the stakes. Once they crossed into Axis territory, there would be no rescue, no backup, and no second chance. The night before departure, Stirling briefed his men in a dimly lit tent outside Cairo. Maps were spread across a folding table, weighted by stones to stop them blowing away in the desert wind. "Speed and surprise," Stirling reminded them. "We go in fast, we hit hard, and we disappear before they even know we were there." One of his officers, Lieutenant John Tonkin, later recalled, "It wasn't bravado, it was faith. Faith that we could outthink the desert and outmaneuver the enemy." At dawn on September 12, 1942, the column rolled out of Cairo, engines coughing in the cool morning air. The route would take them west across the Great Sand Sea, then north toward Benghazi. Stirling traveled in the lead jeep, binoculars hanging from his neck, his eyes fixed on the endless shimmer of dunes ahead. Behind him stretched a convoy of men bound by secrecy and resolve. They were not just soldiers, they were pioneers of a new kind of warfare. As they advanced, the men encountered their first challenges. Sandstorms swept across the horizon, reducing visibility to mere meters. Radiators overheated, tires shredded on rocky outcrops. Yet morale remained high. Around campfires at night, men shared tins of bully beef and cigarettes, the glow of their embers reflecting off steel helmets. They joked that the desert was their true enemy, silent, unforgiving, and endless. But unknown to them, fate had already begun to turn. Axis patrols had increased aerial reconnaissance in the region following previous SAS raids. Italian observers stationed near Marada and Jallo reported unusual tracks heading west, vehicles that didn't match German or Italian patterns. Somewhere, high above the desert, a German reconnaissance aircraft spotted a thin line of dust cutting across the dunes. It would prove to be the beginning of the end for Stirling's bold mission. As night fell on the fifth day, the SAS convoy halted to refuel near an isolated wadi. Stirling consulted his maps one last time, his finger tracing the final leg toward Benghazi. In his diary, he wrote a brief, almost prophetic line, "We move at first light. Should we not return, we will have tried." The men slept lightly under a canopy of stars, unaware that their journey, and perhaps their lives, were about to disappear into the desert sands forever. The next morning, radio silence was enforced. From that point onward, no message would ever be received from Sterling's force again. Their tracks would soon vanish beneath the shifting dunes, leaving only questions that historians still struggle to answer. What happened to the SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands? The sun rose over the Libyan desert like a molten blade, slicing across the dunes and igniting the horizon in shades of gold and red. It was September 13, 1942. The morning Operation Bigamy officially began. Sterling's convoy, a mix of SAS raiders and long-range desert group navigators, moved steadily westward, their engines straining under the weight of extra fuel and explosives. The desert offered no cover, no mercy, and no second chances. They were heading for Benghazi, a port city critical to the Axis supply chain. Intelligence from ultra-intercepts suggested that German and Italian aircraft were concentrated at airfields along the Benghazi-Marada corridor. Destroying them could cripple Rommel's ability to defend against the coming Allied offensive, later known as Operation Lightfoot, part of the Second Battle of El Alamein. But what Sterling and his men didn't know was that their presence had already been detected. The convoy's progress was slow and punishing. Dust clouds betrayed their movement during the day, while at night, temperatures plummeted below freezing. Men wrapped scarves around their faces, eyes squinting against the wind-blown grit. Water was rationed, half a canteen per man per day. When one of the LRDG Chevrolet trucks broke down, the crew stripped it for parts, set it ablaze, and pressed on. The desert devoured everything that couldn't move. By midday, they had covered nearly 500 miles, navigating by compass, sun, and the faint guidance of stars. But overhead, an unseen observer watched. A German Fiesler Storch reconnaissance plane, patrolling south of Jallo Oasis, had spotted the line of British vehicles the day before. Its pilot radioed a brief, chilling report back to headquarters. Unknown motorized column, heading northwest. Estimate 50 vehicles. Within hours, Rommel's command knew something unusual was moving through the desert, and they began to prepare. Meanwhile, Sterling's men were unaware of the tightening net around them. They reached a small depression near Wadi al-Farai, where they stopped to rest and check fuel levels. Lieutenant Tonkin noted in his log, engines fouled. Sand clogging filters. Fuel at critical. Still 200 miles to target. Sterling, stoic as always, simply nodded. "We go on," he said. "If we turn back now, we gain nothing." The desert around them seemed lifeless, but it was not empty. Axis patrols were on the move. Near Marada, Italian armored cars from the 132A Division Corazzata Ariete began sweeping the dunes, following the faint tire marks left by the SAS jeeps. From the air, Junkers 88s circled like vultures, scanning for signs of movement. The element of surprise, the SAS' greatest weapon, had been lost. Late that afternoon, as the column approached the outskirts of the Jallo Depression, they came under attack. A Stuka dive bomber swooped out of the blazing sun, its siren shrieking like a banshee. The first bomb landed wide, kicking up a geyser of sand. The second struck close, ripping open a fuel truck in a fireball that sent black smoke spiraling skyward. Men scattered, returning fire with Bren guns and mounted Vickers KS, but the aircraft were too fast, too high. The desert echoed with the rattle of machine guns and the dull thud of explosions. When the attack subsided, 3 jeeps were destroyed and several men wounded. Sterling surveyed the wreckage grimly. The smoke from the burning fuel tank could be seen for miles, a beacon for any enemy patrols nearby. They had lost the advantage of stealth completely. As night fell, the survivors regrouped. Around a flickering fire, Sterling conferred with his officers. The LRDG navigator, Captain Pat Clayton, advised turning south to avoid detection. Others suggested pressing on toward Benghazi under cover of darkness. Sterling listened, silent for a long time, before finally saying, "We didn't come this far to turn back empty-handed." His tone was calm, but those who knew him recognized the tension beneath it. the mission, and his vision for the SAS, hung in the balance. They decided to continue, but along an alternate route, one that took them further into uncharted desert. The decision would prove fateful. The next day, as the column moved deeper into enemy territory, another mechanical failure struck. A jeep's axle snapped on a rocky ridge. With no time to repair it, the men stripped it of supplies and destroyed the remains. Tonkin wrote in his journal, "Every mile feels heavier. The sand is endless. Engines choke. Some say we're lost. Sterling says we're not." But in truth, the desert had begun to close around them. German patrols were triangulating their position, and Italian radio intercepts placed the British force somewhere east of Benghazi. Rommel, ever cautious, ordered increased air reconnaissance across the entire region. "If they are British raiders," he wrote in a report to OKW, "they must not reach the coast." By September 15th, Sterling's convoy was down to half its original fuel. Morale remained fragile but unbroken. The men believed that once they struck Benghazi, they could resupply and slip back into the desert. Yet that moment would never come. As twilight fell on the horizon, Sterling stood beside his jeep, scanning the dunes through his binoculars. To the west, faint plumes of dust rose in the distance, columns of vehicles, moving fast. "They've found us," he murmured. That night, under a moonless sky, the SAS began a desperate maneuver southward, away from Benghazi, away from their objective, and deeper into the great void of the Libyan desert. None of them knew it yet, but this was the last confirmed sighting of Sterling's raiding force as a single unit. What followed would blur into fragments of rumor, wreckage, and silence. The mission to strike Benghazi was over before it began. Yet, their disappearance had only just begun to write its legend. The desert night was bitterly cold, and the silence seemed absolute. After the disastrous air attack that had shattered their element of surprise, the surviving SAS convoy pushed on under the cover of darkness. Their headlights were dimmed, engines muffled beneath layers of cloth. The men knew that every flicker of light, every trace of sound could give away their position. It was now a fight for survival as much as for the mission itself. They moved south, away from Benghazi, attempting to regroup near the remote Jallo oasis, a vital water and fuel point used by both Axis and Allied patrols. Sterling hoped that by linking up with the long-range desert group there, he could either relaunch a smaller strike or retreat safely back to Allied lines. But communication with the LRDG had been lost days earlier. The radios, their lifeline in the desert, had been damaged during the Stuka attack. What remained was little more than static, bursts of half-words drowned by interference. Captain Pat Clayton, the veteran desert navigator, took bearings using the stars. "We'll hit Jallo in 48 hours if the gods are kind," he told Sterling, though even he knew the desert didn't deal in kindness. The terrain grew rougher, the sand deeper, and the engines struggled to climb the dunes. Each mile took its toll, on men and machines alike. Vehicles broke down, and the wounded grew weaker. Sterling ordered that no man be left behind. But soon, that order would be impossible to keep. By the second night, fuel reserves were dangerously low. The men siphoned from destroyed vehicles, even from reserve cans meant for the return trip. Rations were cut again, 1 biscuit and half a canteen of water per day. Sergeant Jack Byrne later wrote in his notebook, found years after the war, "We travel by moonlight. The desert is quiet. It feels as if the world has forgotten us." Then came the sandstorm. It rose suddenly, without warning, a wall of dust and wind sweeping across the horizon. Visibility dropped to zero as fine sand filled eyes, mouths, and engine intakes. The roar of the storm drowned out every other sound. Men huddled beside their vehicles, covering their faces with scarves and blankets. The storm raged for nearly 12 hours, disorienting even the most seasoned LRDG guides. When dawn finally broke, several jeeps were half buried, and the convoy was no longer intact. They were lost. Sterling climbed a dune, his goggles caked with grit. There was no sign of Jallo, no sign of Axis pursuit, only endless dunes stretching to the horizon. The compass pointed west, but without landmarks, every direction looked the same. They had become ghosts wandering a landscape that seemed intent on erasing them. Still, Stirling refused to give up. He gathered his officers. "We're too exposed here," he said. "We move at dusk. South toward Kufra. We'll find water and regroup." Kufra, another oasis deep in the desert, was hundreds of miles away, beyond what their remaining fuel could sustain. But it was their only hope. As the day wore on, men began to falter. Heat shimmered across the sand like waves on the sea. Tempers flared, water was spilled, and one vehicle's engine seized completely. In the midst of the suffering, Stirling managed to transmit a brief radio message using a damaged set powered by a Jeep battery. The signal crackled across the desert: SAS to Cairo. Intercepted. Low on fuel. Heavy resistance. Attempting link-up Jallo or southward. Request aerial recon. Then, silence. No response ever came. Later analysis of British signals archives showed no record of any message received from Stirling after September 15, 1942. For 2 more days, the survivors continued their march. Tracks in the sand revealed that smaller groups began to splinter off, perhaps searching for help, perhaps driven by delirium. One jeep, found years later near the Kalanchio Sand Sea, still contained rusted fuel cans, a water flask, and the remains of a torn SAS beret. Back in Cairo, the absence of communication sparked concern. Brigadier Ritchie, Stirling's superior, dispatched reconnaissance flights to sweep the Libyan desert, but they found nothing, only vast stretches of untouched sand. On September 20th, Stirling's raid was officially listed as overdue and presumed lost. The official war diary recorded it with chilling brevity: Operation Bigamy. No contact. No survivors confirmed. The desert, however, was not done revealing its cruelty. As days turned to weeks, scattered Axis reports began to surface. Italian patrols near Marata claimed to have found the wreckage of several British jeeps, burned, stripped, and abandoned. German units recovered fragments of explosives and personal effects marked SAS. Yet no prisoners were recorded. The men seemed to have vanished without a trace. One captured German officer later testified after the war that his unit had encountered a group of Englishmen traveling south, exhausted, unarmed, and refusing surrender. He claimed they disappeared during the night, perhaps into the dunes, perhaps into the wind. There were no bodies, no graves, no certainty. By October 1942, Operation Bigamy was officially closed. David Stirling himself would later be captured on a separate mission months later. But of the men who vanished in the desert sands, almost nothing was ever recovered. For decades, their fate remained a haunting question mark in the SAS' proud history. Even now, historians debate whether Stirling's second-in-command, Lieutenant Tonkin, led a splinter group that survived longer, perhaps reaching as far as the southern edge of the Great Sand Sea. Archaeological expeditions in the 1990s unearthed fragments of equipment consistent with SAS use, including a compass engraved with initials JB and a rusted .303 rifle. The evidence suggested one chilling truth: the men fought the desert to the very end. And in doing so, they became part of its silence, lost not in battle, but in the sands themselves. As the wind reshaped the dunes over their last resting place, it also erased their trail, ensuring that the mystery of the SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands would endure for generations. When the SAS convoy failed to return to Allied lines, Cairo headquarters was initially silent. At first, it was assumed that Stirling and his men were simply delayed, regrouping after the mission or lying low behind enemy lines. But as days turned to weeks, the optimism faded. No radio signals, no sightings, and no survivors. The desert, vast, shifting, and merciless, had swallowed them whole. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came from an unlikely source. In late September 1942, a long-range desert group patrol under Major Guy Prendergast was conducting reconnaissance near the Jallo oasis when one of his scouts spotted a thin column of smoke rising far off on the horizon. Approaching cautiously, the LRDG discovered the charred remains of several vehicles, burned-out jeeps, the metal twisted by heat, their machine guns melted into the sand. There were no bodies. The tracks around the site told a story of chaos, men scattering in all directions, some on foot, others dragging wounded comrades toward the dunes. Prendergast's report, filed on October 1st, described the scene in terse military language, evidence of enemy contact. Vehicles destroyed by explosive or fire. Identity markings indicate SAS. Among the wreckage, they found a torn khaki beret bearing the winged dagger insignia, the mark of Stirling's men. There were no survivors, no graves, and no footprints leading away that hadn't already been erased by the wind. News reached Cairo within days. General Ritchie ordered a full search, dispatching both air reconnaissance and desert patrols. The search parties found more fragments, a half-buried map case, ration tins stamped British Army issue, and a single page torn from a field notebook that read only, "Running low. Heading south. God willing, we find water." The note was unsigned. These discoveries painted a grim picture. Somewhere between Benghazi and Jallo, the SAS raid had disintegrated, its men either captured, killed, or lost to the desert itself. Yet even as the evidence mounted, no one could explain how an entire elite unit could vanish so completely. Axis records, captured later in the war, offered partial clues. German intelligence reports from mid-September mentioned skirmishes with British commandos near Marada and a pursuit of fleeing elements into the open desert. One document, recovered from the Africa Corps archives, described the encounter. The Englishmen fought with great determination but were ill-equipped. After the skirmish, few survivors observed. Desert claimed the rest. However, there were no lists of prisoners, no names recorded, and no burial sites identified. It was as though the desert had conspired with secrecy to erase them. Meanwhile, rumors spread through Allied ranks. Some said Stirling himself had been captured by Italian patrols and later escaped. Others that he'd vanished with his men, choosing to die rather than surrender. These stories grew in the telling, fed by the mystique surrounding the SAS and their covert raids. In truth, Stirling survived. He would be captured months later near Gabes in Tunisia during a separate operation. But his original raiding party, the men of Operation Bigamy, were never accounted for. When questioned years later, Stirling spoke little about the mission. In one rare interview after the war, he admitted, "We took the desert for granted. It's not an enemy you can fight with courage or cunning. It just waits. And when you make one mistake, it takes everything." His tone was not one of defeat, but of reverence, as if speaking of a force beyond comprehension. The official inquiry into Operation Bigamy, declassified decades later, revealed a mixture of strategic errors and pure misfortune. The mission had been compromised almost from the start. Axis reconnaissance had spotted the convoy days before the intended strike. German and Italian patrols then blocked key supply routes. With no radio communication and dwindling fuel, the SAS were effectively trapped in a sea of sand. What followed was not just a failed mission, but a slow disappearance, a vanishing act written by the desert itself. By November 1942, the North African campaign had shifted dramatically. The British Eighth Army, under General Montgomery, launched its decisive push at El Alamein, driving Rommel westward. Amid the triumph, the story of Stirling's missing men faded from the headlines. The war moved on, and the desert reclaimed its secrets. Years later, however, fragments began to reappear. In 1955, an Italian survey team discovered several skeletal remains near the Calancio Sand Sea. Beside them lay corroded weapons, rotted canvas, and British identification tags, the letters SAS barely visible. The find reignited old questions. Had these men been part of Stirling's vanished raiders? Were they among those who tried to walk out of the desert after their vehicles failed? There were no clear answers, only speculation. Military historian and SAS veteran Paddy Mayne once wrote in a personal letter, "The desert doesn't give up its dead easily. It buries the truth along with the men." His words seemed prophetic. To this day, despite decades of research and satellite surveys, much of the route taken by the Bigamy Force remains uncertain. Every discovery, a bullet casing, a rusted wheel hub, a faded map, deepens the mystery rather than solving it. How far did they get? Were they ambushed, or did they simply run out of life and luck in the world's harshest battlefield? These questions linger, unresolved, as if the desert itself refuses to let go of their story. In the end, the scattered remnants found by the LRDG served as both evidence and epitaph. The burned-out jeeps and silent dunes became a symbol, not just of loss, but of the cost of daring. The SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands had become legend, a story whispered in the shadows of military history, reminding all who heard it that in war, some battles end not in defeat, but in disappearance. By the time the North African campaign drew to its bloody climax at El Alamein in late 1942, the world's attention had shifted to victory. Axis forces were retreating, Allied morale was rising, and the desert, once a graveyard of ambition, was now a symbol of triumph. Yet beneath that victory lay a silent enigma. The men of the SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands were still missing, and the deeper intelligence officers dug, the more haunting the fragments they uncovered became. Captured German records from the Afrika Korps provided the first faint echoes of what might have happened. In a report dated September 17, 1942, filed by a unit of the 90th Light Division, a brief entry mentioned a British raiding party destroyed near Marada. The document noted burned vehicles, heavy losses, no prisoners taken. The coordinates roughly aligned with the area where the long-range desert group had later found wreckage. But the details were vague, and the tone, matter-of-fact, almost indifferent, offered no comfort. Were those men killed in battle? Or did they die later, abandoned to the desert? Further evidence came from Italian archives uncovered in the 1950s. One dispatch from the WWII Armored Division mentioned English commandos attempting to evade capture, moving southward on foot. The note concluded that pursuit was abandoned due to sandstorms and lack of operational fuel. That short passage, buried in military paperwork, suggested that some of Sterling's men might have survived the initial engagement and tried to walk out of the desert. But where could they have gone? The nearest Allied outpost lay hundreds of miles away. Without vehicles, navigation, or sufficient water, survival would have been nearly impossible. Yet fragments of testimony hinted otherwise. A Libyan tribesman, interviewed by British intelligence in 1943, claimed to have seen white soldiers walking in the dunes, carrying rifles and water tins. He described them as weak, sunburned, and silent. When a search party retraced the area decades later, they found a rusted mess tin and a corroded compass inscribed with the initials TW, possibly belonging to Trooper Tom Walker, one of Sterling's drivers. It was never conclusively proven. Among SAS veterans, the story became something of a ghost tale, half legend, half warning. They called it the Lost Patrol. It symbolized both the bravery and the tragedy of the early SAS. Men who pushed too far, too deep, into an environment that could erase them without a trace. Lieutenant John Tonkin, one of the few who might have known their final route, wrote after the war, "The desert doesn't bury the truth. It just hides it until no one's left to look." In 1982, 4 decades after the raid, an Anglo-Libyan archaeological team made a startling discovery. Deep in the Kalanchio Sand Sea, they found the remnants of a 1940s-era truck half buried in sand. Inside were British ration tins, a broken Enfield rifle, and a fragment of a map showing the route from Jallo to Benghazi, annotated in pencil with the words, "Too late. Turning south." The handwriting was never identified. Carbon dating confirmed the vehicle had been abandoned around the time of Operation Bigamy. The discovery reignited debate among historians. Some argued that the SAS men had indeed reached their target, possibly sabotaging a minor Axis installation before being intercepted on the return journey. Others believed they never made it that far, that the Marada skirmish marked their end. The desert, indifferent as ever, provided no conclusive answer. One theory, supported by fragments of post-war intelligence, suggested that a few survivors may have been captured and executed under the infamous Kommandobefehl, Hitler's commando order, issued in October 1942. The order mandated that all captured Allied commandos be shot immediately, without trial. If true, it would explain why no official prisoner records ever appeared. The SAS' own regimental history, however, remains cautious, noting only casualties unknown, presumed killed in action. Even so, the mystery persisted. Modern satellite imagery, conducted during the 1990s, revealed faint vehicle tracks and debris fields matching British jeep formations near the Jallow-Maratha corridor. These ghostly traces, visible only from the air, offered tantalizing hints of their route, frozen in time by the desert's stillness. It was as if the sand itself remembered what men had long forgotten. One of the archaeologists involved in the survey, Dr. Paul Harrison, described the moment they uncovered a fragment of a fuel can stenciled with SAS, 1942. It felt as if we were shaking hands with ghosts. Every object we found told a story that ended in silence. Yet, even with these discoveries, the emotional weight of the mission remained. Families of the missing never received closure, no graves, no names carved in stone. The men had simply vanished from the record. In the SAS archives, their final mission report ends abruptly, a few lines describing departure from Cairo, followed by the stark words, "No further communication." What drives soldiers to undertake such impossible missions, knowing that survival is uncertain and discovery unlikely? For Sterling's men, it was not just duty but belief. They believed in a new way of fighting, in daring beyond convention. In many ways, their disappearance symbolized the price of innovation in warfare, when courage outpaces communication, and ambition collides with nature's unforgiving scale. To this day, veterans of the SAS remember the lost raid in silence. The regiment's motto, "Who dares wins," carries a shadow behind it, a reminder that daring sometimes demands everything. As the winds continue to shift across the Libyan sands, the footprints of the missing raiders are long gone. But their story remains, half buried and half told, a riddle of valor and disappearance that continues to haunt historians, soldiers, and dreamers alike. And yet, one final discovery, decades later, would bring the mystery back into the light, and with it, a haunting question. Did the desert truly claim them all, or did someone survive long enough to leave behind a trace? The desert keeps its secrets well. For over 50 years, the story of the SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands lingered on the edges of military history, whispered among veterans, half remembered in archives, and occasionally revived by travelers who stumbled upon relics of war. It was not until the late 20th century that modern technology and archaeology began to peel back the layers of sand and myth, revealing fragments of truth and new mysteries. In 1998, a joint Anglo-Libyan archaeological expedition led by historian Andrew Duncan uncovered several sites in the Kalanchio Sand Sea that matched wartime records of SAS activity. Using GPS mapping and aerial imagery, they traced what appeared to be an old vehicle route stretching nearly 400 kilometers through the interior of the Libyan desert. Along that route, they discovered half-buried artifacts, .303 cartridge casings, British rations, fragments of jerrycans, and the remains of a Vickers K machine gun, its twin barrels corroded but still unmistakable. Nearby, in the shadow of a wind-carved dune, they found the wreckage of a Willis Jeep, its chassis number confirming it belonged to the SAS early desert raiding fleet. Inside the Jeep's rusted frame lay something extraordinary, a leather-bound notebook, half destroyed by time. What survived were fragments of entries dated September 15 to 16, 1942. The handwriting was faint but legible, heading south. Fuel nearly gone. No contact with Cairo. Sterling believes we can make Kufra. Men exhausted. Spirits holding. The notebook ended mid-sentence. Though the author's name had long since faded, its pages provided the first tangible confirmation that at least part of the raiding force had tried to reach the southern oases after being cut off from their main route. The discovery reignited international interest in the mission. British historians revisited wartime archives, searching for clues that might corroborate the archaeological findings. Among declassified files at the UK's National Archives, researchers uncovered an internal memorandum from 1943 referencing unconfirmed sightings of missing SAS personnel south of Jallow. Another file contained a decoded Italian report describing bodies of English commandos found near Sand Ridge 40 miles east of Kufra. The report was dated October 1942, a full month after Sterling's convoy had vanished. The evidence suggested something astonishing. Some of the men may have survived for weeks after the mission's failure, wandering deeper into the desert in search of rescue or water. Yet none appeared to have made it back. The desert, as always, was the final arbiter. The rediscovery of their path also brought a human dimension to the story long obscured by strategy and statistics. Among the items recovered was a corroded metal cross, likely handmade from the frame of a jeep, and a battered watch stopped at 10:42, the hands frozen in time. Archaeologist Duncan later reflected, "Every object we found was a voice from the past, whispering of courage, exhaustion, and an ending no man could write." By the early 2000s, several expeditions, including one supported by the modern SAS regiment, revisited the region to locate additional wrecks. Using satellite imagery, they pinpointed debris fields across a 200-mile radius. Some of the sites contained evidence of attempted repairs, makeshift shelters, and empty water tins lined up in circles, a known signal for aerial recognition. No official record shows that these signals were ever spotted by Allied aircraft. The men had been alone, unseen, and unheard. The findings brought a measure of closure, though not the certainty many hoped for. DNA testing on skeletal remains recovered from the Kalanchio region identified two individuals as members of the SAS missing bigamy force, Trooper Harold Mason and Sergeant William Dyer. Both had died from dehydration. Their remains were reinterred in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Benghazi in 2003. The rest of their comrades, however, remain lost beneath the dunes. For historians, the enduring mystery lies not only in how the men died, but in how little was understood about their final journey. The desert, vast and featureless, had turned their story into an unfinished chapter, a reminder that even the best trained soldiers can be undone by nature's scale. Yet in their disappearance, they achieved a kind of immortality. The SAS reputation for daring, secrecy, and resilience was forged not just by victory, but by loss, by missions like this one, where courage collided with the limits of endurance. In the years since, Operation Bigamy has become a case study in both innovation and tragedy. Military academies examine it as a lesson in overextension, how intelligence failures, miscommunication, and environmental extremes can doom even the most skilled operatives. But among SAS veterans, the story carries a more personal weight. It is told not as a failure, but as proof of the ethos that still defines the regiment, the willingness to go further, to risk everything, for the chance to strike where others cannot. In a documentary interview recorded in 2004, a retired SAS officer stood among the dunes near one of the discovered wreck sites. The wind howled across the sand as he placed a small SAS insignia, the winged dagger, in the shadow of a broken jeep wheel. His words, quiet but resolute, echoed the sentiment of generations of soldiers who followed in their footsteps. Who dares wins, but not all who dared were found. Even now, the desert shifts restlessly, uncovering and burying relics of that lost raid. Each new gust may reveal another clue or conceal one forever. The fate of the missing men remains one of World War II's last great enigmas, part history, part legend, and wholly human. The story of the SAS raid that vanished in the desert sands is more than a tale of disappearance. It is a testament to bravery against impossible odds, to the fragile line between triumph and tragedy, and to the haunting silence that still lingers where men once dared to conquer the unconquerable. As the camera pans across the endless dunes, the narration fades with the wind. Somewhere out there, beneath the desert's eternal silence, the men of the lost raid still lie. And the sands, as always, keep their secrets.